I've missed them.
Es maravilloso. Maravilloso. He's amazing.
He's got an amazing fighting spirit.
Yeah. He really is.
Why are they over here? Aren't they supposed to be here?
I don't know.
I love Christmas. I've been here
I-
44
know.
years.
I've been to, I think, 2 hearings with him.
Oh, she's great.
Yeah.
Pero his hearings go on forever, and I can't stay for the whole thing.
Oh, really? Okay.
Hasta que ahora tú te puedes quedar.
No, yeah. I got an 8 p.m. flight.
Oh,
Where's Mary? Okay, she will be here?
She will be here.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
they're just wrapping up the hearing downstairs.
That's wonderful.
We're on to the last members. Actually, some members that you see on to the.
You think Maria Elvira Salazar will be here? No, she's in a different committee? Yeah. Oh, I hope so. She's great. I know. She's great. Awesome. That's great. That's great. She's great. Exactly. Well, I don't know. I said it out loud this morning. I finished it this morning. Oh, really? I don't know if they cut you off. They might. I don't remember. Ileana will know. Ileana, I don't remember. This is my fourth testimony to Congress.
There's a young lady
I've never done the Senate. No, I don't think I've done the Senate. It's all been in the House. But I try to stick to like the time. Sometimes it's hard. Let's ask them. Oh well. They may just cut you off. I don't know what they're doing now.
Absolutely, she loves you, Sue. Thank you. No, I'm leaving as soon as I finish and I get a couple questions, I gotta go. No, thank you though, thank you.
This hearing of the Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I note the presence of a quorum, and I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I would like to just make an announcement and remind audience members that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law. Holding up signs or making verbal outbursts during the proceedings is a disruptive and will not be tolerated. Any disruptions will result in suspension of the proceedings until the Capitol Police can restore order. Let me just begin with a very, very special welcome to the distinguished former House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairwoman, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, for her amazing leadership over the course of 30 years as a member of Congress and as chairwoman. As chair of the Africa Subcommittee, Western Hemisphere. I mean, she did it all and did it with class. And I just want to thank her for her leadership, for her insights, the wisdom that she has displayed for all of us to follow over the years, especially in the struggle to protect human rights and liberty throughout the world, including and especially Cuba. We're deeply honored, Madam Chair, to have you here, providing the Congress and the new administration with a path forward. What do we do next? What steps need to be taken? So again, I can't thank you enough. We will benefit, as we always have, for everything that you have provided. So thank you. I thank all of our other distinguished witnesses for being here. This will become the basis for our next steps as a committee, subcommittee, and for me and my colleagues, so I want to thank you for that. But again, Ileana, it's a delight to have you here. You know, when he was appointed ambassador, and that is Amanda Valladares, to the UN Commission on Human Rights, President Ronald Reagan said, and I quote him, "I have an impossible mission for you. Try to convince the UN that there are human rights violations in Cuba," close quote. Well, I traveled with Mr. Valladares to Geneva for a week to the UN Human Rights Commission. I was happy to carry his bags. I was so in awe of this man who had suffered so much and had done so with such grace. He got the UN Human Rights Commission to investigate the cruelty of Castro's prisons. Missions went there, people were interviewed. Even though there was a statement made that there would be no retaliation, sadly, there was. But it was a breakthrough of a very significant way that he was able to achieve that. I've read his book not once, but twice, Against All Hope, a memoir of life in Castro's gulag, and I encourage people to read it. A brilliant expose of what he and other political prisoners endured, and did so with extraordinary courage, faith, and perseverance. Mr. Valladares said, however, and I quote him, "I can tell you that the saddest thing was to see the indifference of the world towards the human rights violations in Cuba. That is, when my fellow inmates died, were being tortured, were murdered, disappeared, the world absolutely ignored it and didn't want to listen." Well, we are here today to recommit ourselves to the noble struggle by the Cuban people, to stand behind them, to finally achieve freedom. For too long, the Cuban people have long suffered under communism, and now continues that suffering under the current president. 90 miles from America's shores resides one of the most repressive and brutal regimes in the world. 90 miles from the shores, the communist Cuban regime remains ensconced in power, terrorizing and abusing the Cuban people. 90 miles from our shores, the communist Cuban regime remains a threat to the American people and our national security, but especially through their deepening partnerships with the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. Many still wish to speak of engagement without acknowledging the plain reality of the threat Communist Cuba poses to the United States, the world at large, and again, most importantly, to the Cuban people themselves. They yearn for freedom, and they're not free. Today, too many people in the free world do not understand the reality of life in Communist Cuba. In Cuba today, political and economic freedoms do not exist. The Communist Party rules through violence and fear and attempts to control not just the economy, but all elements of society. Civil society lives under heavy surveillance, harassment, and repression. It criminalizes all forms of dissent. It restricts what kind of jobs Cubans can take. It prohibits free movement to and from the island. It is also a Tier 3 country, designated so by the President of the United States and through the Secretary of State and the TIP advisor because of its egregious violations of both sex and labor trafficking. Today in Cuba, nearly 1,000 innocents are imprisoned for the offense of thinking differently from the official Communist Party line. In Cuba, there is no private sector. It doesn't exist. The security state ultimately controls all forms of activity on the island. Every dollar spent by a tourist ultimately benefits the dictatorship. Every instance of American companies or politicians taking trips to Cuba to engage with state entities such as healthcare providers legitimizes the communist regime, furthers their policies of human trafficking. Again, they're Tier 3. They're egregious violators. They're among the worst in the world. And of course, terrorism and violent repression, delaying the arrival of the day when the Cuban people shall be free. And like its close allies, Venezuela and Nicaragua, two other dictatorships, Cuba does not even pretend to hold elections. This is the 5th hearing I've chaired on human rights, in particular in Cuba, although we brought it up in many, many other hearings, as has our distinguished former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. The years may change, but the song sadly remains the same coming out of Cuba. It holds blatant disregard for the very concept of human rights, and the United States requires from us a firm policy. We need to do more, not less. It is time that American politicians, including members of this House, stop signaling to the communist regime in Cuba that if they wait long enough, they will be able to redefine their relationship with the U.S. without lifting their boots from the throats of the Cuban people. At one hearing I chaired in 2015, 3 human rights activists exposed the true reality of life, and they were very, very concerned about President Obama's so-called engagement. 2 months early, President Obama had announced his new policy of engagement with Cuba after many months of secret negotiations with the communists. Obama's push to normalize relations involved a series of unilateral concessions. His administration reopened the U.S. Embassy in Havana, relieved sanctions, restarted tourist flights from the United States without setting any preconditions for improving the regime's awful human rights record. In 2016, President Obama even visited the island, the first U.S. president to do so since the Communist Revolution. In the days before, during, and after his visit, the regime, this was their response, arrested hundreds of protesters. Human rights groups on the island begged Obama not to let himself be manipulated. Instead, he infamously did the wave at a Havana baseball game with dictator Raul Castro after a joint press conference and welcome ceremony alongside the Communist Party Politburo under the portrait of Che Guevara. Normalization legitimized Castro's brutal dictatorship and made the human rights situation worse, not better. Acts of religious persecution skyrocketed and other repression increased. The year Obama visited the island, there were nearly 10,000 documented political arrests, 10,000. I and many of my colleagues in Congress strongly oppose this naive and dangerous policy. I visited with the Cuban ambassador here in the District of Columbia. I said I wanted to visit the prisons. He told me, and it was going good, I thought it was a good conversation. He told me that the Cuban government, however, will decide who I can see and who I can't see. I asked whether other congressional delegations accepted those terms and conditions. He said yes. I never got the visa, and I want to go still. I've asked over and over again, and I will continue to ask to go. I, along with Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, introduced H.R. 1782, the Cuban Human Rights Act of 2015, to prevent a softening of U.S.-Cuban relations without improvements to its human rights record. It needs to be a quid pro quo. Haven't we learned? You know, look at what we did with China. We gave them most favored nation status. Bill Clinton delinked it on May 26, 1994, a human rights conditionality. Delinked it infamously. And they said all they care about is profits, and China has been on a tear to destroy people and their livelihoods, and their human rights have been horrible. I plan on introducing the Cuba Human Rights Act again when we begin, and I know I've been talking to our distinguished former chair to get her inputs as to what provisions it ought to contain. Instead of standing with the Cuban people and demanding an end to their oppression, that outstretched hand to their oppressors, there was a lost decade in the fight to promote liberty and human rights in Cuba. Upon taking office, however, President Trump reversed many of these short-sighted policy, which harmed the Cuban people, and rightly so. The new administration has before it a fresh opportunity to prioritize the recognition of human rights and the release of political prisoners in its dealings with the Cuban regime. Today, our expert witnesses will shed light on the regime's human rights abuses. And again, if you read the country reports on human rights practices, if you read the TIP report, it flies off the page how oppressive they are, but the policy has to match the actual record on the ground, and that's not always the case. So I want to just thank you again. I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Congresswoman Wild, who is the ranking member of our subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you to our audience for being here. I'd like to begin on a personal note. At the last hearing of this subcommittee, which I unfortunately was unable to attend due to a meeting of the Ethics Committee, on which I am also the ranking member, I submitted written remarks for the record. And in those remarks, I stated that in a few weeks, I will no longer serve as a member of this body. But to reiterate, it has been the greatest honor of my life to represent the people of Pennsylvania's Greater Lehigh Valley in Congress over the past 6 years. And it has been a particular privilege to serve as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and as ranking member of this subcommittee. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your many courtesies and kindnesses in the time I've been here. During my time in Congress, I sought to advance a vision of a foreign policy that reflects the best of who we are as a country and as a people. A vision centered on combating hunger, inequity, and disease, both here at home and around the world. A vision that defends universal rights and dignity. A vision that stands with workers and the labor movement whenever they come under attack. A vision that says that we can and must be a voice for prisoners of conscience who languish in prison cells the world over. A vision that says to all those whose rights and dignity are trampled on, you are not forgotten, you are not alone, we stand in solidarity with you. That brings me to today's hearing and to the challenge we face when it comes to shaping a U.S. policy toward Cuba that vigorously defends human rights and human dignity in a way that is strategic and effective in alleviating the suffering of the Cuban people rather than contributing to it. Our approach to Cuba, which has remained largely constant for more than 6 decades now, with the exception of former President Obama's second term, has not delivered for the Cuban people. This hearing begs the question, what is the end goal of U.S. policy toward Cuba? And what has our decades-old policy actually accomplished for the United States, let alone the Cuban people? Today, the Cuban people, not the government, face a devastating humanitarian crisis, which has been exacerbated by the U.S. embargo and other sanctions. The current U.S. policy provides the Cuban government with a ready-made talking point on which to blame every failure and crisis that occurs under its leadership. As Human Rights Watch noted in a 2023 report, the U.S. embargo gives the Cuban government an excuse for problems, a pretext for abuses, and sympathy from governments that might otherwise condemn repressive practices. HRW has also noted that the embargo has imposed indiscriminate hardship on the Cuban population as a whole and has done nothing to improve the situation of human rights in Cuba. Rather than strengthening people-to-people ties, cultural exchanges, and commercial relations, that could open a new market for U.S. exports and benefit businesses in both of our countries. Our policy serves only to further distance Cuba from the promise of a free society. Rather than providing relief for the economic hardship facing the Cuban people, our policy only deepens the hardship faced by everyday Cubans. Rather than seeking to build a future rooted in diplomacy, a future in which we secure the release of political prisoners and advance our interests, as former President Obama began to do, the status quo under administrations of both parties has succeeded only in damaging the image of the United States throughout Latin America and elsewhere around the world. I am determined to see the United States act in defense of human rights and dignity and seek justice for those, like Mr. Connor, who have suffered irreparable damage. That's why we must be at the table, participating robustly in international fora, advancing our interests, and defending our people through relentless engagement and tough, smart, and effective diplomacy. It's why we cannot retreat into a short-sighted and ultimately self-destructive unilateralism. Let us stand with the Cuban people in engagement and partisanship, and let us shape a U.S. policy toward Cuba that delivers results in advancing both our ideals and our interests. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I would like to, and we have worked very closely together on so many issues, including trafficking. So thank you for that service.
Thank you.
It's been tremendous. I'd like to now yield to Ms. Retta Wagon, such time as she would like to consume.
Good afternoon, Talofa. Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Wild, for holding this hearing on the human rights abuses of the Cuban government. Human rights are something I care deeply about. They are universal, and all people should be treated with dignity. All people should have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to elect their leaders and hold them accountable. I've fought for these freedoms for my entire career. I look forward to hearing from each of you as we examine the Cuban regime's attack on these fundamental human rights. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so very much. Ms. Manning?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I, too, will be leaving this Congress at the end of this term, regretfully, because of the extreme gerrymandering in North Carolina. Chairman Smith, I have enjoyed working with you greatly on this committee. I consider you a wonderful colleague and a friend. I have also enjoyed co-chairing the House Bipartisan Task Force to combat anti-Semitism with you. We have worked closely on that committee as well and introduced very important legislation. I appreciate all your hard work to combat human rights abuses and discrimination against vulnerable people on this committee, on our bipartisan task force, and on the full Foreign Affairs Committee. Let me also say, for Ranking Member Susan Wild, I consider you a dear friend, and we will figure out together how to continue our important work from a different vantage point, not in Congress, but we will not give up our determination to fight for people who need our help around the world. So thank you both. Thank you to the witnesses today, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It has been great working with you on so many issues, including
Mr. Chairman, may I
Yes.
just correct one thing that I said? I've been told that the record should be corrected. Apparently, I said, I meant to say, let us stand with the Cuban people in engagement and partnership, and mistakenly said partisanship, which is definitely not what I intended to say. So the correct statement is, let us stand with the Cuban people in engagement and partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our witnesses, beginning with Dr. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who served with distinction here in this body for 30 years. As chairwoman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, as I mentioned a moment ago, but previous to that, the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa, and just did a wonderful job in each of those roles. She passed many foreign policy issues, legislation that continue to enlighten and make a difference in today's world. I want to thank her for that leadership. And again, we've become good friends over the years, and I can't thank her enough for her leadership and look forward to her testimony. We'll then have Maria Werlau, who's the co-founder and executive director of the Free Society Project, a nonprofit organization to advance human rights through research and scholarship. Its leading initiative, Cuba Archive Truth and Memory Project, focuses on transitional justice issues and human exploitation. Ms. Werlau is a former second vice president of the Chase Manhattan Bank and a longtime independent consultant specializing in advisories on Cuban affairs and other international issues. Her extensive publications on Cuba cover a wide range of topics, including international law, foreign investment, and economic issues. She served as task forces on the U.S.-Cuba relations for the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Enterprise Institute. Then we'll hear from Joseph Connor, who's an author, an advocate whose father, Frank Connor, was killed in a terrorist attack by the Armed Forces of the National Liberation, FALN, in 1975. Mr. Connor has testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senate Judiciary Committee. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, LA Times, and the Washington Times. And again, your full resumes will be made a part of the record. And then we'll hear from Juan Pappier, who's is the America's Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch. He supervises the organization's research and advocacy efforts, particularly for Latin America and the Caribbean. He has a decade of experience documenting and reporting human rights violations, including political repression and abuses related to armed conflicts, security policies, and attacks on the rule of law. He has worked as a consultant for Chile's National Human Rights Institute, and we welcome him as well and look forward to all of your testimonies. Dr. Ros-Lehtinen.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith, and I thank you for the undeserved but lovely words bestowed upon me in my almost 30 years of service to the Congress. I'm so proud to have worked alongside you on issues related to freedom, human rights throughout the world. So thank you so much for those words. And Ranking Member Wild and Mrs. Manning, the House will be a poorer place without your strong voices in favor of freedom and human rights as well. So we wish you much success in your future ventures. I've been a good friend of Mrs. Radewagen for the years that her service and my service coincided, and she's always been a strong voice for the freedom of the Cuban people. I'm glad to say that, I'm glad to hear that voice has not diminished at all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will talk today about the need for international solidarity in support of the struggle of the Cuban people for freedom. Apparently, being for freedom is hard for the people who are struggling against the oppressive authoritarian regimes of their own countries, of course, but apparently it's hard for other countries to take notice, to care, or to overcome their own country's political or economic self-interest. Being for freedom seems to be hard, but being for authoritarian regimes seems to be easy. Standing for values is hard. Ignoring values is easy. Authoritarian countries want to reinforce their authoritarian standards, so they seek no moral compass. Democratic regimes, on the other hand, are based on certain moral concepts. Nevertheless, democratic countries seem to always have trouble finding their true north of their moral compass. You have never found it difficult to get the true north of your moral compass, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the Cuban Human Rights Act of 2015. I congratulate you for introducing it at that time when it was difficult with that administration in power. And when I served in Congress, I was proud to introduce alongside you that important bill because it sent a strong message that the U.S. would never ignore the Cuban regime's human rights violations. Sadly, these years later, we're still at this same place, and I'm quite pleased to hear that you will reintroduce this important legislation in the next Congress. We will stand alongside you, Mr. Chairman. We all know about Cuba's oppressive regime. Our witnesses will speak about that, but we will never know precisely how many people longing for freedom and seeking a glimpse of humanity have died in their unsuccessful journeys in unseaworthy vessels in the Florida Straits, filled with hope and terror, and ending in tragic death. We will never know that number. We understand the goals and the cruel motives of regime thugs in exploiting the Cuban population for their own selfish purposes, the lust for power, the greed for material dominance over others. This has resulted in political dictatorships and exploitation of the masses for time immemorial. Likewise, the passive tolerance of and resulting legitimization of such regimes has led to their acceptance by others and the woeful habit of ignoring that oppression. This, the acceptance of oppressive regimes by non-oppressive regimes, is more difficult to understand than the motives and purpose of the oppressors themselves. The motivation and the dictatorial nature of oppressive states to support other similar state regimes is obvious. They share dictatorial values. They have in common a self-interest in protecting their regimes. But why do democratic states tolerate and even aid oppressive dictatorial states in which abuses and persecution of dissidents is clear, and the risk which people take to escape those regimes is so high? The United States government, fortunately, has expressed its dissatisfaction and condemnation of the Cuban regime over the years through our sanctions. But the U.S. government has, on occasion, exhibited weakness in its condemnation of the Cuban regime. The failure to respond to the shoot-down of the Brothers to the Rescue planes in 1996 in international airspace involving the deaths of 3 U.S. citizens and 1 U.S. resident was a regrettable sign of weakness by the Clinton administration. Likewise, President Obama, as you alluded to in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, doing the wave and eating ice cream cones with Raul Castro in Cuba at a baseball game, engaging in friendly conversation, was lamentable fraternization which ignored the immorality of the Cuban regime and worked against the U.S. message of illegitimacy of the Cuban regime. It also undermined the dissident movements on the island, such as the Ladies in White. While the Ladies in White risked jail and savage beatings on the streets of Havana, President Obama hobnobbed with their oppressors. Just last week, as the International Republican Institute noted, another democracy activist in Cuba was killed in prison, supposedly labeled a suicide. False. Marking the 4th verified death of the July 11, 2021 protesters in state custody, according to the watchdog group Justicia 11J, and the 72nd documented prison death since 2023, according to the Cuban Prisons Documentation Center. Why have other democratic states tolerated and even embraced oppressive regimes? There is an idea of non-interference in internal affairs of another state serves as an excuse. Non-involvement in internal affairs of other states is articulated, sadly, in the United Nations Charter. The Charter provides that states shall not intervene, and this is a quote, in matters that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, Article 2, Section 7. And I use the word excuse because the non-involvement concept does not override other principles of international law, especially those espoused in the Nuremberg war crimes trials after World War II. Countries which do not wish to condemn another country's dishonorable or immoral treatment of its residents turn to the non-interference idea as an excuse. Not my job, they essentially say. Another relevant characteristic of the international system is that a state acts based on its own interest. Thus, the oppression of others does not affect my interest. Think Rwanda genocide, or the Cambodian genocide, or indeed even the Holocaust. Of course, this myopic definition of interest and the perception of threats ignores the dangers of the spread of oppressive doctrine. Such expansion of oppressive doctrine is a threat and should be perceived as involving another state's interests. But such perception requires leadership. It requires vision, and they are often in short supply. We need such understanding about the threats posed by legitimizing oppression. Appeasement of oppression carries the same danger as appeasement of military aggression. But many democratic states see no benefit in taking a principled stand against oppression. At least they do not see the benefits sufficient to justify the reduction in trade, the loss of tourism. These are opportunities for their own residents as visitors whose trips are partly conducted on the backs of those who are oppressed. Perhaps the greatest insight in this regard, Mr. Chairman, is that recognizing oppression and exploitation of people is psychologically distressing. We want to think that the world is better than it really is, and seeing the reality causes cognitive dissonance. It is easier to be a Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide, who always sees the world with incurable, excessive, and unrealistic optimism in this best of all possible worlds. But Pangloss's foolhardy optimism is unwarranted in this most dangerous of all possible worlds. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members.
Thank you
for
so
the
very much,
opportunity.
Chairwoman, for that powerful testimony. I'd like to now recognize Ms. Werlau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity and for caring. My written statement focused on some of the Cuban regime's worst crimes, although it violates essentially all rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The human cost of the hemisphere's longest dictatorship ever, at least in post-colonial times, has impacted citizens of many countries aside from Cuba, including ours. Comparisons pale with a regime that kills even defenseless children and keeps its own version, almost identical, of the Berlin Wall at Guantanamo, lasting twice as long without receiving any attention, much less international outcry. It's impossible to do justice to so many horrors and its victims. Today, Cuba's totalitarian military rulers, communist only in name and Stalinist ways, hold on to power by sheer terror. They became apartheid capitalists in post-Soviet times, enhancing their usual monarchic privileges, but continuing to impose failed socialist central planning on the masses to preserve absolute control. As a result, Cuba is a beggar state, a country of widespread ruin in a perennial state of crisis, its people in despair. The system is ideologically, morally, politically, and economically bankrupt, and its only foreseeable future is continuing decline. The dictatorship, bent on remaining in power at all costs, allocates meager resources to building luxury hotels, setting the stage for a Russia-style transition. It hyperfunds a huge secret police for internal repression and a gigantic diplomatic, intelligence, and propaganda apparatus for international influence. It expands its revolutionary model in neighboring Venezuela, Nicaragua, and beyond, has strong alliances with our enemies such as Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China, and with criminal terrorist cartels. It infiltrates governments, including ours, and around the world. It subverts democracies and even attacks our diplomats. The international community offers the regime impunity, engagement, even support, appeasement at best. But the United States is exceptionally positioned to curtail its main sources of revenues. One, its modern slavery, a state-run business exporting doctors, teachers, sailors, construction workers, and many others as commodities. Just the medical brigades raked in around $31 billion in 2018 to 2022. And two, aid from a growing US-based diaspora in remittances, merchandise, travel, telecom, and more, abetted by the loosened sanctions by executive order. Estimated at $52 billion in the 11 years to 2019, this can only have grown with over 640,000 Cubans who poured through the border in 2022 to 2024, and around 100,000 granted humanitarian parole. Enforcing the legally mandated sanctions in the Helms-Burton Law and implementing additional measures under the Trafficking in Persons Victim Act and the state sponsors of terrorism designation would probably push the terminal patient to face its certain death. Cuba's rulers could be forced to negotiate the peaceful transfer of power for a transition to democracy or flee the country, counting on their large overseas assets, plundered systematically for decades. Otherwise, a protracted unraveling will likely lead to a worsening humanitarian crisis with a growing potential for widespread turmoil and violence. Measures that could be implemented very quickly are the travel and remittance sanctions of Helms-Burton. To combat the trafficking, sanctioning ministers of health of Cuba's partners, conditioning funding to PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, and declaring Mexico in violation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Denying visa waivers to all travelers to Cuba, including Canadians. Forbidding most technical scientific exchanges and funding to all Cuban state institutions. There are many more. We're just not out of time. At the very least, these would combat exploitation and other nefarious activities, reinforcing Cuba's structural socioeconomic deformities and deny resources to the military monopoly. Anyhow, enforcement of our laws is essential to our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Connor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members, fellow witnesses, and everyone watching. My name is Joe Connor. Since the Communist Revolution, the Cuban government has been an abuser of human rights, domestically in Cuba and in the United States. Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Cuba violated the Connor family's human rights, specifically the rights of our father, Frank Connor, and other Americans to live. Our father, 33-year-old Frank Connor, and 3 other innocent men, Alejandro Berger, Jim Gazorek, and Harold Sherburne, were murdered while scores were injured and maimed on January 24th, 1975, 50 years ago next month, when the Marxist, Cuban-fueled Puerto Rican terrorist group Armed Forces for National Liberation, FALN, blew up New York's historic Francis Tavern during a lunchtime crowd on the crowded lunchtime. The FALN appointed themselves my father's judge, jury, and executioner, profiling, targeting, and savagely murdering reactionary corporate executives, as they put it in their communique number 3 that day. The Connor family had planned to celebrate my 9th and my brother's 11th birthdays that very night. Francis Tavern was targeted by the FALN, who paid lip service to Puerto Rican independence, but in reality sought to impose a Cuba-style socialist regime in Puerto Rico. They chose it for its proximity to Wall Street and for its storied reputation as the birthplace of American liberty. Alexander Hamilton and the Sons of Liberty met there. General George Washington bade farewell to his officers at the end of the Revolutionary War at Francis Tavern. Between 1974 and 1983, the FALN claimed responsibility for over 130 bombs in the U.S. and Puerto Rico, including another deadly bombing on August 3rd, 1977, when Charles Steinberg was murdered at the Mobil Oil building in New York. Incredibly, I worked in that building 4 decades later. That same day in 1977, an FALN bomb threat caused the first evacuation of the World Trade Center. That's how serious these guys were. Though never prosecuted specifically for the Francis bombing, the unrepentant terrorists served only 18 years of prison sentences ranging from 55 to 70 years. As Hillary Clinton geared up for her 2000 Senate run and was looking to connect with New York Hispanic community, Bill Clinton granted clemency to the FALN, a blatant political gesture orchestrated by then Attorney General Eric Holder. One of the FALN leaders, Oscar Lopez Rivera, was so dedicated to his Marxist cause and his comrades that he refused the 1999 Clinton clemency, although in 2017 he accepted an unprecedented second presidential clemency from Obama-Biden in their last days in office. Shortly after his release, on May 18th, 2017, Cuban President Raul Castro released a message to Lopez Rivera congratulating the terrorist with all the honors and affection you deserve. William Morales, chief bomb maker, was not offered clemency by Obama or Clinton. Morales lightly built a deadly device used at Francis and Mobil Oil. On July 12, 1978, which would have been my dad's 37th birthday, Morales blew off part of his face and 9 of his fingers when a bomb he was crafting exploded in his Queens bomb factory. The apartment contained explosives, incendiary devices, mixtures, tools, FAL, and communiques, and even the copy machine used to make those communiques, including the January 4th one. Morales was captured, tried, convicted, and sentenced in 1979 to up to 99 years, 10 federal, 89 in New York State in prison, but escaped from Bellevue Hospital in May 1977 with the assistance of other radicals who called themselves the Revolutionary Armed Task Force. During the state trial, Morales boasted, "No jail is going to hold me forever. They could put 1,000 of us in jail. They're not going to hold us forever. That's what I have to say." Morales was right. Through an FALN investigation run by the Chicago Terrorist Task Force, Morales was located in Puebla, Mexico in 1983. When the Mexican police closed in, he and an accomplice killed a Mexican police officer. Morales was arrested, charged with being accessory to murder, and imprisoned in Mexico. In 1988, defying President Reagan's extradition demands, the sympathetic Mexican government allowed Morales safe haven to Cuba, where he remains a guest of the regime, along with scores of murderous, felonious fugitives, such as Victor Garena and Black Liberation Army cop killer Joanne Chesimard. On May 2nd, 1973, Chesimard and 2 accomplices opened fire on 2 New Jersey state troopers during a motor vehicle stop. Chesimard and her accomplice wounded 1 state trooper and executed Warner Forster at point-blank range. After a 6-week trial in March 1977, Chesimard was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. On November 2nd, 1979, Chesimard, aided by armed individuals posing as visitors, like Morales, escaped from what is now the Adina Mand Correctional Facility for Women and fled to Cuba, where she's been a guest of the communist regime. Soon after Morales' flight to Cuba in the early 1990s, I began my campaign to have Morales and Chesimard return to American justice, writing letters to the Justice Department, making contacts with the NYPD, State Department, Joint Terrorist Task Force. Meeting only frustration, I persisted, expanding with communications to Presidents George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, New Jersey Senator Bill Bradley, New York's Cardinal O'Connor, and Mayor Giuliani. During this campaign, I quickly realized how closely Cuba and the FALN are connected. For the sake of brevity in my testimony, I will only provide certain highlights. Details are in my written testimony, and for additional information, please see retired FBI agent Rick Hahn's definitive history of the FALN terrorist dawn and my book with Jeff Ingber, Shattered Lives, both sent to the committee previously. And just a couple of examples. President Castro met with, from Shattered Lives in our book, Fidel Castro met with Puerto Rican-born Cuban intelligence officer Filberto Ojeda and encouraged him to form a Puerto Rican armed resistance, which Cuba would help train. In 1974, Ojeda was in the U.S. and he established the FALN along with former MIRA members and supported logistically by the Cuban intelligence services. In October 27, 1975, communique left at the site of the FALN's bombing in the Standard Oil building in Chicago read, "The FALN welcomes the support given the Puerto Rican national liberation struggle at the Solidarity Conference in Cuba. We especially acknowledge the moral support given to our organization by the Cuban people and government in a speech made by Prime Minister Fidel Castro." But the history of Cuba supporting Puerto Rico through terrorism goes back decades before the FALN and the Weather Underground, who was also involved. In September 1979, President Carter, as a significant humanitarian gesture, commuted the sentences of 4 imprisoned Puerto Rican nationalists who were convicted of a 1954 armed assault on the Capitol building that left 5 congressmen shot and wounded. After their release, the freed prisoners jointly embarked on a victory tour, appearing in Chicago, New York, and Puerto Rico. They claimed they had no remorse and could not rule out future violence in the name of Puerto Rican independence. Not long after, they returned to Havana as honored guests of Fidel Castro. The 1983 $7 million Wells Fargo robbery in Hartford, Connecticut was another demonstration of the ongoing links between Puerto Rican Marxists and Cuba. Some of these $7 million went to purchase of a motorhome used for sneaking FALN terrorist Victor Garena into Mexico. Massetti, one of the people involved, waited at the border and helped disguise Garena, handed him a Cuban passport, and arranged his flight from Mexico City to Havana. Cuba kept about half the stolen money, according to conversations the FBI intercepted among los Macheteros members. Despite my efforts and Cuba's sponsoring of terrorists, the Obama administration removed Cuba from the state sponsor of terror list. On July 1st, 2015, President Obama announced the establishment of formal relations with Cuba before actually visiting the Marxist state in March 2016. As Obama announced the Cuba visit, I immediately began receiving texts, calls, and emails from reporters who knew our family's longstanding fight for justice. Ironically, I answered those requests from Joint Base Guantanamo Bay. You see, I'm a 9/11 family member, too. My cousin Steve Scheig was murdered on 9/11 as I saw the planes hit. He was my dad's godson. And I was in Guantanamo Bay at that time, witnessing the pretrial hearings of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other terrorists. Our family has continued to fight through this endless injustices directed at my dad, along with fighting the reprehensible clemencies, ending Oscar Lopez Rivera's 2011 parole bid by facing him at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. We also successfully forced the City University of New York in 2013 to close down the disgusting Guillermo Morales Asante Shakur Student Center on campus. CUNY had a student center named for two convicted terrorists, one of whom was complicit in my father's murder. And my father went to CCNY. Incredibly, but not surprisingly, in November 2017, only 10 months after his second presidential clemency, Lopez was received as an honored guest in Havana, where he paid tribute to the late Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and was decorated with the Order of Solidarity. Our families fought for Morales' extradition to the U.S. for decades to hold Cuba responsible for their role in our father's death and in protecting members of the terrorist group who murdered him. In 2024, following lobbying by our family, the Frank Connor Warner Forster Justice Act was introduced by Senator Marco Rubio, co-sponsored by Senator Rick Scott. The Walter Patterson and Warner Forster Justice and Extradition Act was introduced in the House of Representatives in 2023. We currently have a documentary film on these issues. The Connor and Patterson Acts both call out Cuba for stomping on Americans' human rights, for supporting and sponsoring terrorists. They demand the return of Morales, Chesmar Garena, and others to face justice, and to keep Cuba, the human rights violator, on the state sponsor of terror list. We call on President Biden and President-elect Trump to secure the return of Morales and the other terrorists and guarantee Cuba ends its systemic human rights violations so Frank Connor's life will be remembered for justice. Cuba must first end their sponsorship of terrorists by returning Morales, Chesmar Garena, and all before the U.S. considers their removal from the state sponsor of terror list. Thank you. Joe Connor.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Connor. Juan?
Mr. Chair, ranking members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. Let me start by expressing my solidarity with the Cuban people, with the victims of repression there, and with Joseph Connor, whose family has been seeking justice for 50 years. The Cuban government continues to repress and punish virtually all forms of dissent and public criticism in Cuba. Prisoners Defenders, a rights group, reports that 919 political prisoners remain behind bars in Cuba, and 229 others are under house arrest or other restrictions in liberty. According to Justicia 11J, over 500 people who were arrested in connection with the landmark July 11, 2021 demonstrations remain in prison. Human Rights Watch interviewed more than 170 people involved in those protests, including victims, their relatives, and lawyers. We also reviewed case files, verified videos and photos, and obtained forensic evidence. Detainees arbitrarily detained have been held incommunicado for weeks and sometimes months. Some were beaten, tortured, and subject to other forms of ill treatment. Prosecutors in Cuba continue to frame peaceful actions as criminal behavior. Many protesters have been prosecuted for sedition and sentenced to disproportionate prison terms of up to 25 years in prison. People are convicted on unreliable and uncorroborated evidence, such as statements solely from police officers or alleged odor traces found in rocks, allegedly odor from the defendants. I'd like to draw this subcommittee's attention to some specific cases. José Daniel Ferrer, the leader of the unrecognized political opposition party UNPACU, who remains in prison since July 11, 2021. His family has reported he suffers severe health problems and has repeatedly been beaten. He has announced he is on a hunger strike for 7 days now. Artists Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara and Michael Castillo, who remain in jail since July and May 2021 respectively. They have been sentenced for participating in protest and publishing a meme, among other alleged crimes. 32-year-old Luis Robles, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for protesting with a sign saying, "Fredo, no more repression." He's being held in La Lima prison in Havana. Cuban authorities have also passed legislation to dismantle the limited civic space that allowed the 2021 protests to occur. This includes a new criminal code and abusive legislation on telecommunication and social communication. In addition to political repression, Cubans endure a severe economic crisis. The country has faced 3 nationwide electricity blackouts in the last 2 months, and people suffer frequent blackouts in some places for up to 20 hours a day. The Cuban government acknowledged in July that they only have regular stock of 30% of the basic medicines in the country. A recent survey of 1,100 people by the Cuban Observatory of Human Rights found that 7 out of 10 Cubans interviewed skipped 1 meal per day, and 61% struggled to buy essential elements to survive. As a result of increased poverty and political repression, Cubans are leaving the country in unprecedented numbers. The Cuban government acknowledges that the country lost 9% of the population between 2020 and 2023 to immigration, and independent reports indicate the total figure may be much higher. Mr. Chair, let me be clear about this. The human rights situation in Cuba is dismal, and the Cuban government is solely responsible for the abuses it commits. At the same time, the long-standing U.S. policy of isolation has done nothing to improve this. Rather, the U.S. policy has been counterproductive. We continue to believe that the embargo, and may I add the state sponsor of terrorism determination, have provided the Cuban government with an alleged excuse for its problems, a supposed pretext for its abuses, and a way to garner sympathy abroad with governments that might otherwise have been willing to condemn the country's repressive practices more vocally. Any additional general sanctions on Cuba are likely to harm the population, which is already suffering severe deprivations, and to drive even larger migration flows. Instead, we urge this Congress to take steps towards a new approach on Cuba, one that progressively replaces the embargo with targeted sanctions against officials responsible for human rights violations, one that focuses on garnering support from governments in Latin America and Europe to push, to press multilaterally in a coordinated and strategic manner for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in Cuba, and one that prioritizes empowering Cuban civil society. Thank you.
For that testimony, all 4 of our very fine witnesses. I do have a few questions, and I'll yield to my colleagues that I have some additional questions, hopefully before we have any votes. The situation is dire. And I think it's getting worse. We've had hearings here on Nicaragua and what they're doing to the church and what they're doing to Daniel Ortega is, I met him in 1984. He's only gotten worse. I met him in Nicaragua in 1984 when he was commandant, and his repression is just without end in terms of what they do to innocent and excellent people in their own country. Now, let me just ask you, before I go any further, Frank Calzone is here. I want to thank Frank for his many years of great work. I was at the UN Human Rights Commission 1 year, and he was there as well. And we were working with the diplomats on a Cuba resolution. And he had brought fresh information about child sex trafficking and how horrific that is. We know that in this country you can get up to life imprisonment under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act if you sex traffic a child, and I'm the author of that bill, so I believe very strongly in its implementation. Well, Frank was walking that information around, and a van pulled up. Some thugs from the government got out, and they attacked him. This is in Geneva now. This isn't in Havana. This is in Geneva. So there's an ability to extend their long reach of hate towards people outside the island, and I think we have to be very much aware of that. On trafficking as well, Ileana and I worked very hard to get Liu Xiaobo in 2010 named as the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the great Chinese human rights activist. And I remember so vividly, we had dinner with a number of the parliamentarians that actually make the choice. Who is going to be the Nobel Peace Prize winner? So I spent much of my time, a little bit about Liu Xiaobo, but he already got it, about Cuba. And I asked them about, and three of them that were at our table told me these are the people who actually picked the Nobel laureate. They said, well, they've got great health care, and they send all of their workers overseas, thousands of them, to do work in other countries. Well, the tip report this year, and I said, they coerce them. It's labor trafficking. We knew it then, we know it now. Well, the tip report for this year says that there's 22,000 such workers. 75, let me get the right, 75 to 95% of their salary is taken by the communist dictatorship. So they're working basically for free under threat of coercion and retaliation against their own families. So hopefully this myth that somehow they are doing wonderful humanitarian work abroad is exploded, and everybody wants to speak to that. I just, and that's this year's tip report that points that out. It's ongoing, but it's 75 to 95% of that. And then there's a lot of children who are left behind with that. Child sex trafficking continues to be a real problem. And in every category, protection, prosecution, and prevention, this year, Cuba got worse. And that's right from the U.S. Department of State Trafficking in Persons Office.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You're so correct. And Michael Moore popularized this idea of this great healthcare system in Cuba in his documentary Sicko, which is a complete farce. And people in Cuba are so desperate to come to the U.S. to finally get the cures and the operations and the surgeries that they need. But it's a great myth. The regime has been wonderful in making sure that they can promote this myth. It's a lie, and they make a pretty penny on trafficking, with people. And their doctors program is a prime example of that, as you point out. The first thing that they do is that they separate the families. If you're a doctor and you go to wherever, Venezuela, you will go, but your family has to stay behind in Cuba. As soon as you get to the country, Venezuela, they take your passport, so you're not free to leave. There's no opportunity for you to seek asylum. Then they garnish your wages. I mean, we have words for that: indentured servitude, slavery. But for some reason, the regime has been able to get away with glamorizing this and making it seem as if that's a humanitarian mission. And Venezuela, and I'm just using that as an example, pays the regime for every one of those workers. Now, that doctor doesn't get the majority of the funds. It gets very little of those funds. So the regime makes money for every medical professional that they send abroad. And for a while, one of our previous administrations, they had a great program that allowed these Cuban doctors and nurses to seek asylum in various embassies. And by doing so, then they were able to come to the U.S. That was taken away, but it was a very successful program because these folks know, these doctors, these medical professionals, they know that they're being trafficked. They know that they're being exploited. That's what you have to do in a dictatorship. There's no freedom. This concept of that you have freedom in a dictatorship, they control where you live, where you work, where you study, everything. And we've got to remember that above it all is a one-party system. You cannot have a political party other than the Communist Party. Yeah, there's no such thing as the freedom of choice. They don't even bother having elections because it's, at least Maduro goes through the charade, and then the opposition wins, and Maduro says, no, that was not a legitimate election. In Castro's Cuba, they just, they do away with that. No election. They'll have, you have the choice of of one person, one party, and that does not an election make. But yes, indentured servitude with their medical program is one of those myths that they have. They do it for humanitarian reasons, and that it's that the Cuban people are happy with their health care program. Nothing could be further from the truth, but that's part of the myth that they've been able to successfully promote internationally. And no, that Nobel Prize committee, would they ever recognize a true freedom fighter, of which there are many who are sacrificing what little they have, their very lives, to speak for freedom. And, you know, I referenced the July 11th movement. It was a massive protest throughout Cuba. Many of them have lost their lives. Many of them were killed. The rest were jailed. And others are exiled, as Ortega has done in Nicaragua, when he threw out 200 of priests and human rights activists. They just get rid of the opposition. And that's one of the perks of being living in a dictator, being a dictator in a dictatorship. You get to do whatever you want, and people will just turn a blind eye. They don't see it. They don't see what they don't want to see. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, I thank you. Yes.
Mr. Chair, we at Human Rights Watch have produced an entire report about the abuses against these doctors in medical missions in Cuba. Yes. The Cuban economy gets $6 to $8 billion a year through these medical doctors. This is the highest source of income of foreign currency to Cuba, higher than remittances or tourism. And I have personally interviewed some of these doctors who fled Venezuela, and because they are not allowed to take their own passport with them, they're given an official passport which only takes them so far. They are forced, when they come to the United States, to come through the Darien Gap and risk their lives in that very dangerous jungle. I interviewed them there, and they told me about the abusive regulations they're subject to when they're in medical mission. These regulations establish who they can talk to, what kind of things they can say, what they cannot say, who they're allowed to meet during their mission. And as you mentioned, they pocket their money, on average 85%, in some cases more.
Just very briefly, I was the sponsor of the Global Magnitsky Act, and it really was derived from the Belarus Democracy Act, which I wrote in the year 2004, sanctioned individuals and sanctioned so they can't get a visa and they can't do business here. There are only 3 Cubans that are on the Global Magnitsky. I mean, Cuban leaders. There should be a large number of abusers that are on that list. So we got a call for that as well. And I think that's what you were getting at in terms of more targeted. So that's something for the new administration. I have other questions, but I'll yield to Ms. Wild.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Pappier, to comment on the impact of sanctions on the Cuban population. I know that we are not alone, but we are isolated in terms of our position in the United States on this embargo. I think the only other country that voted with the United States on this was Israel. And I would like to know from your perspective, and then I'm going to ask Ileana also to comment on the same, how you believe that it unnecessarily hurts everyday Cubans.
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member. First, let me say I agree with you that the United States is isolated on this issue. The policy of isolation towards Cuba has isolated the United States. It has not isolated Cuba. And I think the votes in the UN General Assembly are very clear on this. Since 1992, the General Assembly has voted condemning the U.S. embargo every year. And by promoting this policy, you have been given a platform for the Cuban government to present itself as a victim, instead of allowing the world to see that they are perpetrators of gross abuse.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you to direct your answer. I don't want to hear about what the UN General Assembly has done. I'm aware of it, and I've read about it. I'd like to hear from what you know about the impact of the embargo on citizens on an everyday basis.
Absolutely. Let me draw your attention to there is a report by the UN Secretary General on November 1st, 2023, where every agency of the United Nations analyzes the impact that the embargo and the sponsor of terrorism determination has, both on the Cuban economy as a whole and or their own capacity to provide humanitarian assistance. So in that report, for example, UNICEF, the UN agency in charge of children, World Food Program, in charge of food, they all mentioned that they have limitations in their capacity to provide humanitarian assistance because of the embargo and because of the state sponsor of terrorism determination. I would say that the economic catastrophe we have today in Cuba is not exclusively because of the embargo. There are other factors, including the severe mismanagement of the economy by the Cuban regime, and external factors such as the collapse of the Venezuelan economy and the COVID-19 pandemic, but is definitely exacerbated by the embargo and by the state sponsor of terrorism determination.
Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, I would say point number one is that the real embargo that is taking place in Cuba is the embargo that the regime imposes upon its people, where they don't have freedom of press, they don't have political parties, they don't have election, they're not free to dissent from the government. It's a one-party system. When it comes to the embargo that the Cuban people feel is being imposed unfairly by the United States, the Cuban people are voting by coming here to the United States in every way possible. They have been fed a diet of anti-U.S. rhetoric since the day that they were born. Those are their official books that they have in school, saying the American people and the American government hates you, wants to keep you hungry, wants to keep you sick, and it's all the root cause is the embargo. And they'll nod, but they will try to do, this table would last 2 minutes in Cuba because it would be a raft trying to come to the United States.
Well, just help me understand
Sure.
then how the decades of U.S. policy, other than that second term that I mentioned of President Obama, has advanced the cause of the Cuban people.
Well,
How has it helped them?
Because doing the right thing, even if you're by yourself, even if no one else is imposing an embargo, even if it's just us, it's still the right thing to do. And to reward a regime that is able to get everything that it wants from 200 countries throughout the world. And yet there's only the United States that is causing this great pain for the Cuban people. You can get everything that the Cuban people want from all of the other countries that have incredible trade without any restrictions. So if there is lack of food in Cuba, and there is, it is not because of the United States. It's let's have all of these wonderful countries contribute more food. You know where it goes? To the regime. And what does the regime do? It sells it to other countries. And you will often find all of these great foodstuffs from Canada, let's say, one of the greatest trading partners and tourism partners of the Castro regime. Their goods will be sold on in the markets. It never gets
the
to
only
the
thing I
Cuban
would point
people.
out, you mentioned before the number of Cubans that want to come to the United States, and obviously there's a limit on the number of Cubans who will be able to come to the United States. I'm not sure that any administration would welcome people who, by your words, have learned to despise the United States. And I think future chances of coming are even less than they've had. So, if as a subcommittee that cares deeply about both global health and human rights, I'm struggling with this issue. And I understand what the right is right answer, but at the same time, it's been many decades and it hasn't accomplished anything that I can see. Do you want to comment further, and then I'm going to yield, Mr. Chairman?
I think if the U.S. continues to do the same thing, it will produce the same results, and the results are more repression, more poverty, and more migration. That's what the situation in Cuba is right now, and will continue to be as long as this policy continues.
I guess the problem I have is that, as you stated, all these other countries are providing goods and so forth. How effective is our embargo? Is it just we're doing it to use your words, because right is right, or because we actually think we can accomplish something with it?
We wish that there were more international solidarity. So what we're asking is for other countries to join us, not for us to say, oh, we're doing this all by ourselves. Let me join the folks who are keeping the regime in power.
Wouldn't that just hurt the Cuban people more?
It doesn't hurt. The Cuban regime has everything, gets everything it needs from all of the countries in the world. Everybody is trading with Cuba. There's an abundance. They have it, and they can provide it to the Cuban people. They choose to do other things with the food and the medicine that they get. There's no embargo on food. There's no embargo on medicine. You can collect them in your neighborhood and ship it to Cuba tomorrow. There's no problem whatsoever. You fill out a little card like this, and I'm not even exaggerating. It's saying this is food stuff and medicine, and I'm sending it to the people of Cuba. And you can fill a whole bin and send it over there. The problem is they won't get to the Cuban people. It'll get to the regime. They will sell it. They will give it away, and they pay no price for it. But the Cuban people are not fooled. They know we're a generous country.
Okay, I do just want to ask one more, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Again, back to you, Mr. Pappier. What programs and initiatives, if any, have been the most effective in promoting human rights and civil liberties in Cuba?
I don't think there has been much success because, as you mentioned, the policy for 60 years has been pretty much the same, except for the 2.5 years under the Obama administration. And I would say the limited results in that policy, the fact that in 2.5 years, the policy did not produce a political reform in Cuba is not a reason to go back to a policy that has failed for decades. What is needed as a policy is multilateral support. And the reason why there is no multilateral support, the reason why other countries join the United States in condemning Venezuela, join the United States in condemning Nicaragua, but do not join the United States in condemning Cuba is the embargo. The embargo creates a distraction and impedes the multilateral efforts that are necessary to press for a democratic transition in Cuba.
Thank you. I yield.
Ms. Radovic?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's so good to see you, Madam Chairwoman. We've discussed Cuban political prisoners today, but the regime also holds Americans in prison. Many of you know the case of Ileana Lopez, an American who was unjustly and arbitrarily arrested in Cuba in 2017. She remains trapped in Cuba today under house arrest and unable to leave the island. Her mother in Miami just recently passed away. I mean, it's a heartbreaking and cruel case. Congress strongly calls on Cuba to release Ileana. Are you familiar with this case? Why is Cuba detaining innocent Americans? How can we get her home?
Thank you. I thank you, Ms. Radowagen, for bringing this important case up. And like most authoritarian regimes or terrorist organizations, they understand the value that Americans place in a human life. And so the fact that an American or a Cuban American is being held unjustly in jail, they want to get something in return for her, just as the terrorists that we have seen in the Middle East have done so. They hold hostages under false claims of accusations, and they want to see how can we bargain? What can we get for this life? They place no value on human life, and this is just another sad example. There's so many people who are languishing in Cuban jails, and whose names we will never know. But anyone who speaks out or dares to threaten the regime in any way is thrown in jail, and then they'll see what they can get for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Werlau, please describe your organization's Truth and Memory Project in further detail. Why is it so important to record and commemorate the names and faces of those killed or disappeared by the regime in Havana?
Thank you for the opportunity. The Truth and Memory Project records the loss in lives attributed to the Cuban Revolution. It starts with the Batista dictatorship up until now, and it covers the loss of life on all sides of the political spectrum. We have around 11,500 individual records of victims. And it's important because, of course, this tells the story of a very undercounted horror, because, as you mentioned, the balseros will never know. Deaths in prisons, are very undercounted, extrajudicial killings. But it personalizes the suffering of the Cuban people and others who have paid the price of this terrible saga that Cuba is living under. We also have two other projects. One is based on the export of the Cuban labor, the medical missions that started in 2010. We started publishing reports. There's many reports on what was described here that is even worse than what is reported sometimes. I've interviewed dozens of doctors just 3 weeks ago. A doctor who was sent to Guinea-Bissau told me that they had found out Cuba was paying $10,000 a month for her service, and she was getting $250. So that's technically like 97% of the salary. Our third project is based on Cuba's interventions, how Cuba has spread its model, infiltrated governments, and I think if you allow me the opportunity to tie in what was discussed here before about why the embargo has not worked, I would say the opposite. Engagement has not worked. The whole world has engaged Cuba. There's a revolving door of presidents, kings to be, ministers, human rights activists for over 6 decades trying to convince the Cuban regime to dialogue about human rights, to bring about reforms. That hasn't worked either, because those totalitarian regimes do not succumb to dialogue or to entreaties. And what we have is a United Nations system that is morally bankrupt, that has abandoned the Cuban people with a cheap shot at the United States with an annual declaration against the embargo that says nothing. But in terms Cuba, the dictatorship of Cuba sits in the UN Human Rights Council, is elected to the executive body of numerous United Nations entities, and nowhere have I seen any resolutions against any human rights violations of Cuba, much less what the United Nations is going to do with its responsibility to protect the oppressed people of Cuba. So I think what explains what we're seeing, Congresswoman, and we have multiple reports on this, is a Cuban regime that expends its resources on 126 embassies in the world, more than Spain, more than Canada. They each have an intelligence center. Cuba has almost 1,700 solidarity groups around the world that it funds, parliamentary friendship groups. This is the totalitarian, bankrupt nation of Cuba. How do you explain that? That is what explains that they buy influence, sway opinions, manipulate perceptions so that people think that it is because of the U.S. embargo that there's a totalitarian criminal regime for 60-something years oppressing the Cuban people.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Manning?
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for organizing this hearing, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here, especially our former colleague, Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen. We are so glad that you're here with us, and thank you for all the work you've done in the past and continue to do. I want to commend Chairman Smith, and I want to echo your demand that Cuba should return Joanne Chesimard, a fugitive who murdered a New Jersey state trooper in 1973. I also want to acknowledge a constituent and good friend in my district, Bobby Mendez-Inchastegui, whose family suffered terribly under the Castro regime. After the revolution, Bobby's father was thrown in jail as a political prisoner. He watched his neighbor's children being shot and killed in front of him on their front lawn, and he and his mother, who was a journalist, were forced to flee the country. After many years, Bobby's mother was told that her husband had died in prison. She was devastated, but she subsequently remarried and tried to build a new family for Bobby. Imagine her heartbreak when years later, her first husband was released and searched for his wife and son, and what should have been a joyful family reunion was a cruel blow to all, with a devastating and long-lasting impact that Bobby still talks about today, as the entire family was broken. It's hard to believe that all these years later, the cruelty of the Castro and now the Diaz-Canel regime, replete with its human rights violations, continues. And my heart goes out to all the Cuban families who have suffered and continue to suffer under the cruel Cuban regime. And Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen, as you know, my dear friend, our dear friend and colleague Debbie Wasserman Schultz has made valiant efforts to help free Cuban political prisoners Michael Castillo Perez and Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara. And they have been unjustly imprisoned since the Cuban regime's crackdown on the July 11th, 2021 pro-democracy movement. And like my good friend, I urge both President Biden and President-elect Trump to continue to seek freedom for these political prisoners, along with hundreds of other political prisoners illegally jailed by Cuba's secret police. How can we do more to prioritize their plight?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, and thank you for your years of service. We will miss you, and I know that you've been very active, especially in the Jewish community and the federations, to build that solidarity. And many of your mission groups go to Cuba and help the
Yes, they do.
families there. So we thank you for that. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, an amazing champion for the cause of a free and democratic Cuba, as is Federica Wilson, as is Lois Frankel. And before Ted Deutsch, who's now the head of the AJC, we have been blessed in our Florida delegation to have such incredible bipartisan support in favor of freedom, human rights, and all the goodness that we enjoy here in this beautiful country. May all the enslaved people in the world have it, and especially my native homeland of Cuba. I think that there's more that we can do. Each one of us can be that ambassador of truth and hope. We can do whatever little thing that we can in our own communities and in our own way to shed light, to give, in your vaulted position, to give a 1-minute speech on these Cuban prisoners who are not known. There's some who are very, very well known, and there's some who just languish in jail and they think that no one hears them. To be able to write a letter to the editor, to your local paper, to be active in your church and synagogue and bring up their case and help them in Cuba. There's just a lot that every person can be that beacon of hope, and I never underestimate the power of an individual in making that amazing change. So we're blessed to have that kind of bipartisan delegation in Florida, and New Jersey has it as well, and many other places. But everyone can do more. Each day we should rise up and say, how can I make this a better place in my neighborhood, in my school, in my community, and for oppressed people elsewhere. Because we're all one island, and we're all interconnected.
Thank
and
you.
what happens elsewhere impacts us all.
Thank you so much. Let me move to the other end of the table for my second question, because I want to get one more in before we have to go for votes. And as I said, I strongly oppose the tyrannical regime, the Castro regime, now the Diaz-Canel regime. And I share the frustration that my good friend and colleague, Representative Wild, was expressing. And I think many Americans feel the same way. We're just concerned that the many, many years of the embargo just has not brought about the political and economic reforms that the Cuban people deserve. So, Mr. Pappier, let me just ask you, what else can Congress and the administration do to bring about the change and also to help improve the daily conditions for the Cuban people?
Thank you for that question. To bring about a reform, change in Cuba, you need, broadly speaking, two things. One, you need multilateral support. And secondly, you need an empowered civil society in correlation of force with the Cuban government. The embargo sadly has impeded both. It has impeded multilateral efforts, and it has imposed an indiscriminate hardship on the Cuban people. We need to end this policy of isolation, think afresh, start afresh on Cuban policy, start working with Latin American governments and European governments to press strategically, multilaterally, the Cuban government, and replacing these general sanctions with targeted sanctions against the specific individuals and the specific companies, I may add, who are responsible for the atrocities that are being committed in Cuba.
So that is unlikely to happen in the next administration. Are there any other steps that we could take?
Sadly, I think the efforts of the United States on Cuba are very much undermined by the policy of the embargo. There are other efforts you can take, but the embargo undermines your capacity to produce change, undermines your capacity to find allies to push for these reforms to happen. I would be happy and encourage for targeted sanctions against those people responsible. I would encourage you to give more visibility to specific individual cases of political prisoners, including some of the ones I mentioned, and to work multilaterally with other governments. But I fear that the embargo creates a whole distraction and makes it very difficult to create this multilateral coalition for democracy and human rights in Cuba.
So I suspect we could go back and forth from one end of the table to the other end of the table. We can agree on the goal that we want. We just simply can't agree on how we can get there. So with that, I will thank you all for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you. Just a couple final thoughts and questions. Oh, did you want to? Please, Maria.
She's prodding me to answer you. Yes. So I think, with all respect to my colleague, and I think we share the same goal, that's wishful thinking. Yes, the embargo is a distraction. Look at how we're talking about this. But to blame the embargo for a totalitarian regime that commits egregious crimes against humanity for 6 decades is wanting to be blind about a situation. This is not about individuals. This is a whole system of way of life. And it's a dynasty, it's their successors. Yes, I believe, of course, multilateral sanctions would be best. But the world ignores Cuba. And it's too late. The Cuban system is imploding. The main sources of revenue from Cuba are in our hands to cut, to get that regime to recognize, face the reality, and allow for a transition to democracy. Nowhere in those propositions to sit in dialogue with Cuba or find a multilateral position is there any solution to this. None of these countries are presenting this. It's too easy to push it onto the United States and to forget the Cuban people. I think we have the obligation to finally see this through. What we have not done is apply the sanctions. The so-called embargo has been diluted by executive mandate for many, many years. And the border is porous. This is constantly allowing an inflow of people who are sending money to Cuba, traveling back to Cuba, having claimed a legitimate fear of persecution, calling, sending aid. The embargo has not been enforced. And right now, it's at the tipping point. So that's what I believe. Maybe there will be more suffering. There should be a humanitarian assistance, multilateral program to aid the Cuban people. But feeding the regime and its conglomerate is only going to prolong the failed system that oppresses the people, that there is no way out of this economic crisis because it's a parasitic, bankrupt economy. Thank you.
Well, one thing we've learned in the past 2 weeks is that you never know what's going to bring down an oppressive, horrific regime. So maybe we can all hope that in the new year we are surprised in Cuba just like we've been surprised in Syria.
Thank you. Let me just ask a couple of final questions. I'm all for multilateral sanctions, but as the distinguished chairwoman said, if we have to go it alone, we ought to. I supported apartheid sanctions. There were many people who thought that that would be injurious to the people of South Africa, but I thought the horrendous apartheid system needed to be confronted, and thankfully over time that did jettison that off the face of the earth. We need allies. I'm shocked when I talk to other diplomats and other members of Congress and parliaments what a naive view they have about Cuba, especially as it relates to the foreign the people that they deploy elsewhere for medical reasons. You know, you tell them 75 to 95% of that money is going to a dictatorship. That's trafficking, and that's what the TIP report says. It's trafficking, indentured servitude, as you said, Ileana. One of the things that grabbed me when I read Amanda Valladares' book, and then talking to people who have been imprisoned in Cuba. We've had Dr. Bichette. We've had so many people come and testify over the years. And it was that torture is a given in those prisons. One of the things that Amanda Valladares talked about was they took the prisoners, put them into human waste, it submerged them. It went into their ears, their nose, their eyes. They all got infections. It was totally degrading. I mean, what evil dictatorship does that? And it was so bad that when Amanda Valladares' wife gave birth to their children, he couldn't change the diapers. He had PTSD on that. Now, I've written 4 laws on combating the problem of torture. They're called the Torture Victims Relief Act. And it's all about the PTSD. We've got hundreds of thousands of Americans or people in America who come from all over the world, who have been in prisons all over the world and have been tortured. They need help. What do you say to a dictatorship that's doing this every day as we meet here? They're being tortured so horrifically. Valladares talked about the Ho Chi Minh Poles. They made sure that you didn't sleep. They would go in there and start hitting you, and they called them Ho Chi Minh Poles. And that's just one of many. China, maybe more than anyone else, has perfected the cruel art of torture. I've had many hearings on that. I chair the China Commission. So what did we do there? We delinked human rights from trade on May 26, 1994. That was Bill Clinton. I joined with Nancy Pelosi in deploring that because we just gave away the store. And look what they've done ever since. They are a colossus when it comes to military capability, threatening not just Taiwan, but hegemony throughout that region, but even us. I mean, China really is very strong these days. And we did it. It wasn't the Europeans, we did it. Through a false sense that if you just trade more and lift the sanctions and the linkage to human rights, they'll matriculate from dictatorship to a democracy. Nothing. I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge if you really believe that, and I don't think any of you believe that. The International Red Cross has not been there since 1988. Why aren't they there? Talking to people, chronicling what's going on in terms of the use of torture. So to lift the embargo, we need to get more allies, make a new effort to get others to join us. First it was the Soviets, and then it was the European Union and others who just continually offer lifelines to this cruel dictatorship. So I think the next administration ought to try very hard to get others to say, and that goes for places like China as well. We've learned that lesson. I can't tell you how many people have told me they wish they had voted, because we had votes on it, on PNTR, Permanent Normal Charity Relations. They wish they could have that vote back because they realize it didn't work out. It's gotten worse in terms of genocide against the Uyghurs and everything else. Nobody there from ICRC since 1989. I mean, what does that tell you? So I with all due respect to my good friends and colleagues, and to you, Juan, I don't believe that lifting I think we need to double down on that, get other countries to join us. So I would ask that we, look at that very seriously. I believe in targeted sanctions, but I also believe, like I did with apartheid, I was, criticized for that by some. You're going to hurt the South Africans. But they need to be free of that racial prejudice that's being levied against them. So anyone want to comment on that? But we've got to renew our efforts to expose this cruelty. This hearing is the beginning of a new effort. And again, having the distinguished chairwoman, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen here, nobody speaks stronger or better about it. And there's something to say one other thing. The enablers of this country, I had a Reverend Walker come when Elian Gonzalez was abducted from his home, and Mary Lasis and the others couldn't believe it when people with guns came in and extracted him. Well, I had a hearing on it. And we had a Reverend Walker from my own state, and he goes, I want to tell you, my favorite scripture is Matthew 25. When I was in prison, did you visit me? And he goes, I visit the people in the prisons. So I said, okay, do you visit political prisoners? And I had a whole list of people that, and he said, he hesitated. Lincoln Diaz-Balart, he had joined us on the panel. He goes, gentlemen yield? I said, of course. He said, name them. Name one political prisoner that you visited. He didn't have anybody. Next thing you know, he was walking out the door to catch a plane. He didn't know it. I mean, stop enabling. I'm not saying that to you guys. I'm saying it to those who just look the other way. Torture is the cruelest thing. I don't know how anybody overcomes that. And we know from the PTSD that they suffer. And this regime gets A+ for their horrible use of torture. I mean, they do it very well, as do the Chinese Communist Party. So, double down on sanctions. Yes.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Just to, first of all, to clarify to Maria's comments, with all due respect, I made very clear in my statement that the Cuban government is solely responsible for the atrocities it commits. It's solely responsible for those atrocities. I share your concerns about torture in Cuba. We have documented them extensively. Here are reports of torture that we have documented of people detained on July 11th demonstrations. And I have also, in preparation for this hearing, listened to some of the hearings on Cuba in the past 10, 15 years. And I've always listened to something along the lines of what you just mentioned, Mr. Chair, with all due respect. If only we wait a little bit more, if only we pressure a little bit more, we impose a little bit more of sanctions, maybe that will produce results. It hasn't produced results for 60 years. We need to try something different.
If you deal, we thought that with China. When delinking occurred under Bill Clinton, May 26, 1994, Republicans and Democrats alike said this is going to lead to, improvements. It only got worse, and it got significantly worse. So I think we need to realize it only makes them stronger, more effective, and richer. The bad guys become richer. It doesn't help the average person, and it certainly doesn't cause a change in politics, because for them, make sure Colonel so-and-so is running this business over there and making money hand over fist. Maria, did you want to?
Can I, Mr. Chairman, can I share a story with you for the record? Randall Robinson, the architect of South Africa sanctions, I heard him speak at Columbia University in the early 2000s. And then I went over to talk to him. There was the journalist, the reporter for Radio and TV Marti, was recording this. So I asked him, so if you are he was talking about how sanctions had been so important, how they were right even when they weren't effective, and then they were. So I said, so why is your stance on Cuba so different? Because it is notable that many human rights defenders have the opposite stance with respect to sanctions on Cuba that they would have on the Pinochet regime, the South Africa regime, et cetera. Well, you know what he said? He said, oh no, because there are no human rights violations in Cuba.
That's astonishing. Mr. Connor, just if I could ask you, you wrote Secretary Blinken earlier this year requesting that your father's killer, Willie Morales, be extradited to the U.S. Did you get a response? And one last question to you. I know you're trying to get the University of New York to take down the naming of the center. I mean, to name it after Joan Chesmard and Morales is just absurd.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, they had a student center called William Morales de Santos Shakur at City College of New York, and it had been supposedly taken down in the early 2000s. And on a hunch which I've had over the years, I called them years later, and sure enough, it was open. So I went up there by myself with my phone and camera, and I started taking pictures. I've sent them to some of the guys on the committee here. And then I called the school and said, I'm going to go public with this, that you have a student center named for terrorists. And my father went to CCNY, and I didn't see anything there in his honor. So they fought me a bit, which I was a little shocked. And then they said, well, yeah, it's a freedom of speech thing, but we're gonna compromise. We're gonna take it down. And we're going to say that it's because we need that space for education. So when they went to do it, a near riot broke out, and cops were called in, and it was basically filled with like these guys from like the 1960s who were still living their 60s and 70s weather underground crap, and had infiltrated there and were using that. They weren't even students, most of them. They were using that center for their own These guys are my age type, they're old. And they cleared them out, and to my knowledge, it's not been reopened, but it was really a slap in the face that they would do something like that. But not a surprise. This is what goes on in academia. Well, what passes for academia.
Chairwoman, would you like to close us?
It really is shocking, the amount of ignorance and willful ignorance. Even when you point it out to them, you're glorifying terrorists, and still the hold that the Cuban regime, the mystique, of Che Guevara and the revolution, and that was all in favor of the downtrodden, that it still permeates in so many of the college campuses. It's sickening. But as we saw,
Yes.
look at the anti-Semitism that was alive and well in all of these Ivy Leagues. It's sickening, but
Columbia University has hired
yes,
terrorists
yes.
over the years, and look what you get when you hire terrorists. You get students who start believing that stuff.
And to disguise this as freedom of speech is just ludicrous.
It's ludicrous.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
I want to thank our great panel. Sorry we started late. That's because of the Blinken hearing. We were precluded from. That's right. And we can't have a hearing simultaneous with that in the committee. So thank you so much, and
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
appreciate all of your information. Even when we disagree, we do it civilly and
Thank you, Mr.
respectfully.
Chair.
Thank you.